Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
On a dark, cold afternoon in November of 1869, Daniel McFarland, a middle-aged ne'er-do-well attorney, entered the New York Tribune building on Printing House Square in Lower Manhattan. He settled into a desk at a subscription room, feigning work, keeping an eye out for one man in particular. No one seemed to take notice of McFarland, for he had occasionally contributed to that most prestigious publication. Shortly after 5 o'clock, Albert Richardson walked in, a handsome 36-year-old star reporter with a wide forehead and neatly trimmed goatee. Richardson walked to the counter to pick up his mail, as he did most evenings in town. Suddenly, McFarland rushed forward toward Richardson and fired a pistol at gun's length. The blast blew out a gas lamp and plunged the room into chaos. McFarland fled into the winter dark. Richardson, shot through the torso, was carried to the Astor House, New York's finest hotel. There, Richardson lingered for a week and died. Before passing, he and his fiancée, Abby Sage McFarland, McFarland's former wife, were married in a hasty bedside wedding officiated by the Reverend Henry Ward Beecher. Police found McFarland at a local hotel. He readily confessed. It seemed an open and shut case with a motive eyewitness and a confession. Yet McFarland pled not guilty by reason of insanity, launching a legal process that drew national attention, including from a humorist just settling into life as a newspaper editor and husband, Samuel Clemens. Clemens knew Richardson personally. He had approached Richardson for advice on publishing with Bliss of the American Publishing Company. Clemens later complained to Bliss over his delay in publishing Clemens' own work in order to accommodate Richardson's biography of Ulysses S. Grant. The McFarland trial became a national sensation, exposing ideas about unhappy marriage and the propriety of divorce. It also featured extraordinary company, a best-selling author, the nation's most respected newspaper editor, and a preacher known as the most famous man in America. Clemens followed the trial, wrote about it in several editorials, and eventually echoed some themes in his novel, The Gilded Age. My presentation today is from a larger project on the Richardson murder and McFarland trial. I look at Clemens' commentary and what it reveals about his views of marriage, divorce, the insanity defense, and American justice system. Let's look at the timing. The murder coincided with major transitions in Clemens' life. While Richardson lay dying at the Astor House Hotel, Clemens' fiancée, Olivia Langdon, shot for her trousseau 2 miles north at the stylish Madame Fogarty's dress shop. On the day Richardson died, Libby's father, Jervis, signed papers for a fashionable house in Buffalo as a surprise wedding gift. So that's the locations there. 2 and 3 are the Astor House Hotel and where it was shot, and actually this one up here is the dress shop. So very close. Clemens was 2 weeks into a 4-month lecture tour while McFarland sat in the notorious Tombs prison, just a stone's throw from where he shot Richardson, assembling a defense team and top medical experts to assess his mental stability. By the time the trial began in April 1870, Samuel and Livy were married and settled into their new home, and Samuel had realized his dream of owning part of a newspaper, the Buffalo Express. Marriage and divorce were at the center of the McFarland trial. To understand why, it helps to look at the broader context for marriage in the mid-19th century, how McFarland's attorneys manipulated it, and how Clemens responded. Since McFarland claimed temporary insanity, his attorneys needed a cultural narrative potent enough to explain it, one built around his wife's abandonment. Marriage was foundational in the Gilded Age. Over 90% of Americans married at some point, and many saw it as the bedrock of morality and social stability. Women were expected to marry young and preside over loving, well-managed, morally upright homes. Clemens' own experience seemed to confirm this ideal. He called his first months in Buffalo House fairyland, waking each morning in a home he called Aladdin's Palace. Livy, quote, poured out her prodigal affections in kisses and caresses and in a vocabulary of endearments whose profusion was always an astonishment to me. It broke upon me like a summer waves that break upon Gibraltar. Livy was also pregnant. When his lecture agent proposed another tour, Clemens balked. Why crucify myself nightly on the platform? I've got a lovely wife, a lovely house, bewitchingly furnished, a lovely carriage, and a coachman whose style and dignity are simply awe-inspiring, nothing less. And I'm making a lot more money than necessary. Looking back at the Gilded Age, marriage appeared remarkably stable in both qualitative and quantitative evidence. Yet marriage was also under strain. Some women's rights reformers increasingly cast it as a trap rather than a privilege. As early as 1851, Ernestine Rose had said marriage reduced a wife to a purely submissive being. In 1860, the tension crystallized in a public debate among three prominent reformers: Horace Greeley, the powerful editor of the New York Tribune; Robert Dale Owen, a well-known Indiana reformer who had helped his father establish the idealist community of New Harmony; and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, the women's rights advocate. The debate began when Greeley published an editorial just as New York legislature was revising marriage laws. New York had some of the strictest laws of any state, permitting divorce only on the grounds of adultery, whereas Indiana was the liberal divorce state of the era. Easier divorce, Greeley asserted, would unravel the social fabric and harm children. Indissoluble marriage, exception for adultery, was the bedrock of society. It restrains the libertine who would otherwise use and discard women. It was for the best for children, it was biblically sanctioned, and it was the chief reason for, quote, the moral, intellectual, and eventual material supremacy of Europe over Asia. Indiana, with its liberal divorce laws, Greeley wrote, was the paradise of free lovers. Owen shot back that liberal divorce laws lead to good marriages, since spouses had to treat each other better to stay married. Restrictive divorce laws encourage adultery, prostitution, and certainly a lot of hypocrisy. Why, he asked Greeley, does Greeley only write about immorality in terms of illicit sex? Isn't household strife immoral, domestic hatred immoral, heartless selfishness and inhuman treatment of the weak immoral? Elizabeth Cady Stanton went further, and while testifying before the New York legislature, she stated lawmakers were, quote, wholly ignorant of what marriage actually looked like behind closed doors. The institution's legitimacy rests on human happiness, not tradition. Most Americans, though, found the idea of easy divorce abhorrent. Stanton's own father, the man she most admired, scolded her so harshly over her stance on divorce that she wept bitterly and felt the sting for years. There's no clear demarcation for who would favor divorce reform. Horace Greeley opposed it, yet he had been a leading proponent of abolition, workers' rights, land reform, and many other causes. And he was joined by some women's rights reformers who believed indissoluble marriage protected women and society. Antoinette Brown Blackwell, for example, believed a wife's highest social obligation was to work for a wayward husband's redemption within marriage. Once people know that they can exit it, they become all the more unhappy with it. So some reformers believed that marriage should be dissoluble, and others did not. The controversy over divorce in New York had been heightened by a contentious divorce settled just a year before the Richardson demise. Peter Strong sued his wife Mary over her affair with his brother, and she countersued, alleging that he had forced her into an abortion and was sleeping with the abortionist. Newspapers covered this case obsessively, linking the unsavory details to the concept of divorce. Within this context, let's look at how Clemens reacted to the McFarland shooting and the unhappy marriage that preceded it. New York newspapers, including the Buffalo Express, were largely sympathetic toward Richardson at first, but coverage soon soured. The day Richardson died, the Sun called him a libertine who seduced a married woman. Clemens pushed back against the these false refinements and moralizing by others. If Richardson had caused divisions in the McFarland marriage, then he deserves condemnation. But if the circumstances are as his friends describe, that a drunken, abusive McFarland had alienated his wife's affections, then critics should hold their fire. A miserable marriage, Clemens wrote, was worse than widowhood. The next day, Clemens went further, writing an editorial calling for divorce reform in New York, something easier than New York, but stricter than Indiana. A recent letter to the editor had endorsed the restrictive divorce practices of Roman Catholicism, but the editorial asked if this resulted in a superior state of morality in Catholic countries. Isn't it likely to create lovers' triangles that are worse than divorce? This language could have been written by Robert Dale Owen or Elizabeth Cady Stanton themselves. Clemens recognized the harm of an abusive marriage and called it immoral, and he measured the value of marriage, at least in part, by human happiness and not solely by the need for social stability. Clemens never wavered in calling out McFarland. Even after defense attorneys convinced much of the public that McFarland had been a loving and loyal husband, Clemens labeled him a mean, small villain. Like many high-profile trials, the McFarland trial was rich in cultural meanings. The most popular newspaper in New York City, called the New York Herald, called it the greatest domestic drama of the age. It was also, in a strange way, a rematch, as McFarland's lead attorney, John Graham, had defended Peter Strong in the divorce case settled a year earlier. Another McFarland defense attorney, Albert Jerry, had been Mary Strong's lawyer, and the judge who presided over the Strong divorce case now prosecuted McFarland. The prosecution's case took less than 2 days, with clear motive, eyewitness, medical testimony, and a confession. The law presumes sanity, so there are no experts called to establish it. The defense took a month. They contested no major facts, but instead built a narrative that a wife's abandonment could drive a husband insane. They would use the McNaughton rule imported from Great Britain, which required a finding of not guilty if the defendant could not discern right from wrong at the time of the incident. Graham, the lead defense attorney, had used the rule in the first successful use in the 1859 Sickles case. That's the first successful use of the McNaughton defense. Congressional representative and later Union General Dan Sickles murdered his best friends just yards from the White House after finding out about an affair with his wife. The shock created temporary insanity, Graham had claimed, and the jury and most of the public agreed. Like all good trial attorneys, Graham launched his strategy at jury selection. The defense team then put on friends and acquaintances who testified that McFarland was a loving and attentive father. The reality was quite different. He was alcoholic, often absent, financially unreliable, and occasionally violent. Abby McFarland, a genteel, sensitive soul, had married at the age of 19 when he was 20 years older at 39. He had lied about his prospects, and she had reluctantly taken to the stage to support the family. After years of abuse, Abby had obtained a divorce in Indiana so she could marry Richardson, spending a year there to qualify as a resident. But New York law did not recognize the divorce and prevented a spouse from testifying against a spouse. So Abby could not present an accurate story of their miserable marriage. And when Abby's friends testified, McFarland's attorneys attacked them as progressive thinkers who undermined traditional family values. They even put out a journalist to talk about the Oneida community in upstate New York, a communitarian experiment that voided the nuclear family and promoted sexual encounters outside of marriage, despite the fact that these women had nothing to do with the Oneida community. Smearing went beyond sexuality. Graham, at one point, without evidence, claimed that prosecutors were anti-Irish. McFarland had immigrated from Ireland. New York City was filled with Irish immigrants, and yet then Graham then talked of his own pride and his Gaelic ancestry. Defense attorneys also raised McFarland's family history of insanity, citing his brother who had been treating in New York's insane asylum on Blackwell Island. They also put on the stand medical experts who testified that McFarland was insane at the time of the shooting, using evidence that today reads as transparently bogus. Clemens' response to these courtroom dynamics shaped his lasting suspicion of the insanity plea. 2 weeks into the trial, he published an editorial called "The New Crime, Legislation Needed," citing the rising use of the insanity defense and cataloging its abuses. A wealthy family buying an acquittal through the insanity defense, a sane man freed because he resembled an insane relative, a clearly insane woman who was hanged anyway. Quote, "Is not the insanity plea becoming rather common?" Clemens asked. His proposed cure outlaw insanity itself, and those found guilty of insanity should be imprisoned anyway. McFarland, he wrote, was a criminal in treatment of his wife, and he noted that while society may condemn an abusive husband, they will not penalize a husband who kills his wife's paramour. And that thinking is exactly what McFarland's defense team was banking upon. 3 days before the verdict, Clemens endorsed Mississippi Governor James Alcorn's proposal that a special dedicated court should determine if a defendant is truly insane. If found insane, then the person, quote, "should be held in custody as a dangerous lunatic and receive the treatment due to insanity. If not, they should be tried for murder." Jurors acquitted McFarland in less than 2 hours, and most of the newspapers celebrated. The New York Times wrote, "McFarland's provocation was very great, and that it was of a nature to unsettle the foundations of his reason." Clemens mocked the outcome, listing 15 reasons McFarland must have been insane. He was beery, driveling, stupefied animal, insane. He hadn't supported his family, insane. He'd told multiple people he was going to kill Richardson, insane. And he'd been anxious and uneasy before a shooting and excited the day after, clearly insane. Clemens then spun the tale into absurdity. McFarland, quote, "fell upon his friends with teeth and nails, boots, and office furniture. He killed nearly 50 people and cast into the streets a half-dozen marble columns, each weighing 2 tons. Authorities finally captured McFarland and sent him to the asylum. Had the jury hanged McFarland in the beginning, they would have done him a mercy and this country a service." Clemens was not alone in his outrage. A week after the verdict, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony week after the verdict, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony led over 3,000 women in a protest at Apollo Hall in Lower Manhattan. They burst into applause as the 54-year-old Anthony crossed the stage dressed in sober Quaker clothing and clapped ardently as Stanton crossed the stage in a slow, dignified gait. Stout, middle-aged, dressed in black, and a smiling face framed by white curls, she could be anyone's mother. The deep national interest in the trial was not because of McFarland, Abbey, or the murder, Stanton said, but because it involved, quote, "the momentous question of marriage and divorce, questions that underlie our whole social, religious, and political life. Men had created laws for their benefit, and since most states made it nearly impossible to divorce, women in awful marriages remained tied to their abusers. Abbey's marriage," she said, "was, quote, nothing more or less than legalized prostitution." Stanton likened Abbey to a runaway slave who was captured and returned to slavery. Abbey could not defend herself in a trial, quote, "for neither women nor slaves can testify against their supposed masters." Most newspapers covering the protest were openly derisive of the women of the protest. The New York Times reported it was an immense assemblage of sharp-visaged, gaunt-figured females. Every once in a while there was a bare sprinkling of pretty young women, and a matronly-looking one comfortably there, fleshy and jolly enough to indicate that she fed not on philosophies nor hugged newfangled notions to her heart. In a final critique of the McFarland trial later that summer, Clemens returned to mockery. The trial, he said, was unburlesquable because it was, quote, "so extravagant and grotesque that nothing is left for burlesque to take hold of." The insanity defense, he noted, was already disreputable, but with its increasing use, the lawyers have got to cutting every gallows rope and picking every prison lock with it. It's become a sneaking villainy that ought to hang and keep on hanging its sudden possessors. When looking back at these developments, we can see that in many ways Clemens was a traditional Victorian man. He praised Livy's refinement and credited her with civilizing him. That should have positioned him to side with the jurors and the public who celebrated McFarland's acquittal. But Clemens sided with some of the era's reformers in calling for easier divorce, for judging marriage by happiness rather than social stability, and by showing genuine sympathy for an abused wife. He despised what the courtroom had become, a stage for manipulative attorneys, gullible jurors, and a fickle public that could celebrate a killer. Clemens' mistrust of the insanity defense fed a broader contempt for the American justice system, one he returned to in a short story written about this time called Lionizing Murderers, where a fortune teller assures a future murderer that he'll be hanged, but comforted along the way by clergy, opinion makers, and adoring young women. In a July 4, 1873 speech to Americans in London, Clemens put his views on the courts and the insanity defense more bluntly. "We have a criminal jury system which is superior to any in the world," he said, "and its efficiency is only marred by the difficulty of finding 12 men every day who don't know anything and can't read. And I may observe that we have an insanity plea that would have saved Cain." Clemens was, in these scenarios, against the tide. When New York law and public opinion resisted easier divorce, he called for it. When skillful lawyers convinced much of the country that McFarland was a victim, Clemens called him a mean, small villain. And when the public celebrated an abandoned husband's acquittal for murder, Clemens saw no justice in it. Love and jealousy were powerful forces in human life. But when passions turn lethal, the courtroom, he believed, must remain steadier than the heart. Thank you.